Shalom, great men of Yahweh. We're going to be continuing on this evening in the 17th book of Yisrayl. We're going to be in chapter 6 this evening, which is found on page 67. It's the 17th book of Yisrayl, chapter 6. This is the book of Yisrayl entitled The Greatest Gathering of All Time. The latest and the greatest of books available here from pastor's lips to the black and white on paper that we're able to get and to learn from. And the title of this sermon Pastor gave just a little bit over a year ago, which was given on Romans 2:18, 2017. And the title was The Gathering of Refugees for Yahweh's Service is Taking Place in This Generation. The gathering of refugees for Yahweh's service is taking place in this generation. Pastor says, Shalom everyone. We've got a house full today. I want to have a lot of racket now for Yahweh, okay? Joyful cheering and praise to Yahweh. Praise Yahweh, you may be seated. Praise Yahweh, may the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. So, you know, if you're newly tuned in, or, you know, maybe you missed some of the intros, you know, we should be making a lot of racket praising Father Yahweh here. Okay, man, that's what the racket and all the noise is for. Sometimes the children outdo us here, man. You know, they'll be all loud and screaming. We need some of them manly, deep screams, you know. But rejoicing before Father Yahweh on the Sabbath, you know, it's a great thing to be praising Yahweh for the wonderful opportunity to learn righteousness in these last days. Now, we're going to move here. He says, the news there is hard to get, but I tell you it's playing right in with the prophecies today. Okay, and then we're going to go over here to verse 6, where he's talking about the articles that have been put out. And the article from last week, which was entitled, this is the blog post that he puts out every week. This one was entitled, Let's Reason Together. That's the best way to bridge differences between nations. Okay, so the best way to bridge differences between nations is to reason together. Remember, the scripture talks about, come, let us reason together. You know, we in order to find a solution to problems, individuals have to be willing to communicate, you know, and to sit down and work things out, you know, kind of see what the difficulties are and what can be worked out between them. And although you might see certain things in the news, which we know the news builds up a lot of propaganda for certain things, but since this sermon here, we've kind of seen things a little bit on the international scale kind of calm down a little bit, and more of the news is more building on the domestic level. But, you know, be not deceived that even though we see on the international level, we see different people meeting together in these different summits and such, you know, these leaders, they have marching orders. You know, they have instructions that come forth from the city that sits on 7 hills. You know, and they have plans and ideas that must be followed. You know, so one minute people will be making deals and sitting down for summits. You know, just as it was before that, they're talking about annihilating each other and making irrational comments about each other, derogatory statements. You know, and then a little bit later you see they'll go and, I don't know if anyone remembers back, it was just a short couple of years ago. I know time does fly, but it was just a short couple of years ago when Libya was led and ruled by Muammar Gaddafi. And for years, for like a long time, like decades, you know, since the bombing, I believe it was in the 80s, the Pan Am bombing, and Libya was blamed for that. And since then, you know, for I think it was close to like 2 or 3 decades where they didn't have no kinds of, you know, relations with the Western world. You know, they were cut off by, how does the Western world cut things off? Well, of course, they use sanctions. And so by sanctions, they were cutting off Libya from being able to, you know, trade with the rest of the Western world. And then on the news just a couple years ago, you know, there was like a turnaround. You know, it was saying that Libya agreed to get rid of certain things, and they were going to open up trade between the European nations, and I think they actually signed some oil deals with Europe, some different deals with Europe. And then just a short time period after that, just a little while after that, then before you know it, Libya is being invaded and Gaddafi's oppressing his people. I mean, he was in office for like 40 years or something, and all of a sudden he's oppressing his people, and all these different things are taking place. So you can see that, I mean, they never liked the man for a long, long time, okay? But there's certain things that go against their plans, their instructions, against this new world order, as they call it. But we know it's nothing new. It's the same thing that Cain was promoting, but it's the desire to remove righteousness and to put in place wickedness, and the Catholic Church, through their teachings and through their ambassadors that they send out, to these nations, and they give these instructions, if things aren't going according to their plan, I mean, that quick, they'll just take someone and, kill them, and he was, I don't know if y'all remember, but he was brutally killed. Actually it was on film. They actually had it on film, some of the brutal, evil, wicked things, and you could see the mindset of those who had went after him, because they did some immoral, unlawful things to him, and most of the Western world, I remember specifically a woman, I guess we'll call her a woman, but she laughed about it. She was in an interview and she was laughing that, we came, we saw, and he's dead, and this is a great thing. Like, this is going to bring world peace. Go read about Libya today. It's the worst it's been, in the past 30, 40 years as far as stability, because in mankind's ideas of solving their problems through force, they actually remove the things that have kept certain groups of nations together for a long time. And you can look at just Syria, Libya, Iran, Yemen, Lebanon. You can look at some of those countries in the past 10, 20 years. Some of those countries for a long time, were led by, one individual. They called dictators, by one individual, and they had a, what would you call it? They had things kind of worked out. Everyone knew who the boss was. He was the dictator or ruler, or whatever they called him, and he told people what to do, and they did what he told them. And the country actually, Iraq, Libya, they sold a lot of oil. They were selling a lot of oil and making a lot of money. I remember reading an article once about Libya where they talked about in Libya there was no homelessness. Homelessness was like smallest across the entire earth, because they had certain sets of rules that they followed, and I think it was inspired by the leader's mother that people should be in housing. So even if they couldn't afford the housing, they put them in housing, and they took care of them, and they did, as Pastor talked about some other countries years ago, how they would take care of people from the cradle to the grave. They'd be able to be given a job, given a place to live, have a purpose in life, be able to do certain things. Now we know Muammar Gaddafi wasn't, he wasn't following the peaceful solution of Yahweh's laws. I'm sure that there were certain moral rules and guidelines that was handed down to him from whoever taught him that allowed him to be able to achieve the success that he did. And we know that on his own he wouldn't have been able to bring complete peace to his country, but he was able to maintain a stability that when these nations start fighting together instead of reasoning together, as Pastor talked about in this article, instead of bridging differences, I mean, they just go in there and they just mess everything up. They mess everything up. They create huge amounts of chaos. And this is what occurs when force and when means of following an evil empire. This is what we see. And we know this Roman Empire is still ruling the earth today. Do not be deceived by the old men in their robes with their fancy dressed Swiss guards. We know that the Roman Empire is strong and alive today, stronger than it's ever been. And it's actually taken and reaching out with its tentacles into the entire earth. And those who do not follow the will of Mother Mary are being squeezed to death, just as Malachi Martin wrote. So Pastor says here in this article, let's reason together. That's the best way to bridge differences between nations. Remember that next time you have a conflict in your life, reason together. Don't just jump to conclusions and judgments of different things. You gotta make sure you're using the peaceful solution to examine the situations and make sure You're not building wars and destroying relationships, but you're actually able to bridge differences between others. And Pastor talked about this article it's up to 156,000 people. And the one before that, what does forgiving sin mean to those who promote sin, asked Yisrayl Hawkins, and that's up to 175,000. Pretty great reach there, and we can see how through the, you can be turned over to page 68, we can see how through the increase of knowledge and technology that the message of Yahweh is able to reach out from here at Abel into all these different nations. A lot of those nations like Iran, China, which are real strict on what comes in through the internet. A lot of those nations, we have a lot of viewers and interest from those countries because they're living in a society that doesn't make any kind of sense. Their life feels meaningless and useless because they don't realize the plan that Yahweh has for mankind. So when they come across the teachings of Yisrayl Hawkins, they actually latch onto these things. And Yahweh showed that we would be reaching these people from all over the world. And this is what's taking place here at the end of this last generation. Okay, the end of mankind's evil, beastly governmental systems. And this is the only time, remember what Pastor spoke about? Those 66 books that were written by all the righteous men who lived before us from Genesis to Revelation. No one in history of mankind ever had all of it together in one book. You go through there and you see how it was generation from generation, and many of those books were written. They were on scrolls, especially the book 2 of the book of Yahweh. Those things were captured up and took up by the Catholic Church, and they locked those things up, hoping that they would never be seen again. But we know that Yahweh had a plan for that also, and He allowed those things to be held back so that it would come down to this last generation where there would be this, there'd be the renditions that came out, and then there would be the opportunity for the one He has chosen to preach His name and to show Yahweh's righteousness to be able to come forth and to actually put back the original writings the closest that they can be. And that's what we see in the book of Yahweh, the closest thing to the original Hebrew writings that we see on the face of the earth today. If you go over here to verse 12 on page 68, Pastor was reading in Isaiah chapter 58 and 13 and 14 while he was quoting it. He was talking about this example. Okay, this example where it says in Isaiah 58, where it says, turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath. Okay, turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath. Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. It even goes into detail here. I think we have enough time here. We can actually read that. Isaiah chapter 58 for your notes, or if you have your book of Yahweh. But the great prophet Isaiah actually showed in detail the importance of what you should be doing on the Sabbath day and what you shouldn't be doing. It says, if you will turn away your foot from breaking the Sabbath, this is Isaiah 58:13, from doing your own pleasure, your own business, your own pleasure on my holy day. So you can see what we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be breaking the Sabbath by doing our own pleasures, our own business, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of Yahweh honorable, and will honor Him by not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor engaging in idle conversation. Then you will find your joy in Yahweh. And this doesn't mean you can't conversate on the Sabbath. It just means to guard your conversations. Don't be speaking about what you're going to do after the Sabbath or all the things you did before the Sabbath. If they don't build up the great house of Yahweh, we have plenty of things to conversate on the Sabbath. All the things we've been studying and reading and learning, the services, the workshops, all the classes. Then you will find your joy in Yahweh. Okay, remember, this is if we turn away our foot from breaking Yahweh's Sabbath, then we will find our joy in Yahweh, and Yahweh will cause us to ride on the high places of the earth and feed us with the heritage of Jacob our father, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken it. Pastor's been striving now for, many decades, 40, 50 years here to try to get us to realize the importance of just Yahweh's name and the great Sabbath day, I know we go over a lot of other things, but really, if you really look at all Pastor's teachings, if you start going through the books of Yisrael, all the older sermons to the newer sermons, Pastor's trying to get us to realize who Yahweh is and how we're supposed to keep His Sabbath so that we be able to achieve this salvation that's being offered in these last days of being a part of Yahweh's great priestly family. And Pastor says here in verse 12 on page 68 of the 17th book of Yisrayl, he says, so you have to turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath, from doing your own things on Yahweh's Sabbath. Instead, we're not supposed to do our own things. What are we supposed to do? Instead, do Yahweh's things on Yahweh's Sabbath, because the Sabbath is His. Remember, and that's the rest. The rest isn't lay back, go to sleep, or do like some poor deceived people do, where they think they can't do nothing, so they got to put their catheter in and lay down on their bed and start their fast, because they've been deceived by all these different translations, and mainly by this Babylonian Talmud, where they feel like the Sabbath can't do no work, so they can't use the bathroom, and they can't go out of their room, and they can't open doors, and they can't drive cars. And I remember Pastor talked about, I think it was in Keeping the Sabbath as Yahweh Kept the Sabbath, and the 9th and 10th books of Yisrael. He talked about the foolishness that we see in the land of Israel today amongst the so-called holy people that they call themselves, these Jewish people, because they've been led by what? By Babylonian Talmuds, these oral traditions, not Yahweh's laws, oral traditions. So instead, do Yahweh's things on Yahweh's Sabbath, because the Sabbath is His. Remember, it's about serving others, and there's so many different ways to serve on the Sabbath day, from making sure people are fed, to making sure people have a place to go, a clean place to learn and to be taught, to being, even just sitting in the class on the Sabbath. I know it seems hot sometimes, and you probably could think of a cooler place to be. Possibly you could, maybe I could too. But actually just sitting in the classes and participating in class is a service to others, and that's not even referencing the service that it's going to do to those in the future from the knowledge that we're storing up into our minds, but it's a service to our fellow brothers. I don't know if you've ever been to a class where there's just like 2 people, or maybe no people, just yourself. It's kind of a little, you get a little tired of answering all the questions and raising your hand, and man, it looks like the speaker's just constantly just looking at you, So on the Sabbath day, when we have all these different classes, the more people that come to class and participate in the classes, and not only does it help the teachers and those training to be teachers, not only does it help those in the future who we're going to be able to teach this righteousness, but it helps our brothers that are sitting right next to us on the Sabbath day doing the same thing. This is a part of serving others. I know it doesn't really feel like you might be doing a whole lot except participating in class, but that's actually a huge service right there, and then it just builds from there. There's so many other things that need to be done on the Sabbath day, and that's not even to mention the things that come up, on a second-by-second basis that have to be dealt with. But, there's a huge need for servants on the Sabbath day, and that's what we should be building ourselves to be, is to be servants and finding our place in helping to serve our fellow men or our fellow brethren. The Sabbath belongs to Yahweh, Pastor says here, continuing in verse 12. The Sabbath belongs to Yahweh. It's your appointment with Him to sweep His floors, dry His dishes, whatever needs to be done. It needs to be done on that day, even gathering up the scraps. And there's a whole lot. I don't know, if we haven't seen very much, maybe on the Sabbath sometimes, you could spend the whole day in the sanctuary, but, every once in a while if you get a little break between classes, just take a walk up to the cafeteria or, down to the peaceful scene or something. You'll see there's a whole lot of work being done on the Sabbath day, Yahweh's work that needs to be done to prepare for Yahweh's people, not just to prepare for us who are here now, but remember, we have a lot of people who are going to be coming. Remember those numbers that we just read, 156,000, 175,000? There's going to be a huge influx of people, and everything that's being done right now in this present time period is to prepare for those who are soon to be called to Yahweh's house. And whether they're called or whether they're just hungry, they're going to be coming to Yahweh's house, because we know there's going to be 2 billion people who are going to be utterly devastated because of man's lust and greed and having their own ways. Okay, we're going to go over here to page 69 and verse 18. Just remember what we covered there on page 68 about the Sabbath is Yahweh's, and it's our appointment with Him to do whatever needs to be done. And at the least, we could be getting here for services on time. Services start at 9 a.m. Pastor always said, come early, not late. we should be getting up here for 9 a.m. where by 9 a.m. we can be seated, we done used the restroom, had our coffee, Sabbath bread, whatever it is we want to get done, but the sanctuary, they open at like 7:30 where you can come in, get coffee and your Sabbath bread, so that gives us almost a whole hour and 45 minutes to still be early. But let's make sure that we're striving to be on time for the services. If it's not something, some individuals got to milk the cows, the cows and the goats don't hold their milk on the Sabbath, and take a break. No, our brothers have to go milk the cows and milk the goats and do the different jobs that have to be done. But if it's not something that we've been assigned that has to be done, we need to be making it here on time for services, which start at 9 a.m. So we should be finding our seats in our seat by 9:45. Because if you notice, the young guys, they're always ready to be going right at 9 a.m. Yahweh willing, if the lights stay on, Last Sabbath was a little interesting, but those kinds of things come up, and look how quick Yahweh's people get the problem solved and we move forward. Here in verse 18 on page 69, Pastor's talking here. He read, and he was referring to Genesis chapter 49, verse 1, where Jacob told his sons to come and see what would befall them in the last days. And he says here in verse 18, Yada and the 12 tribes, they were Christians. They were Coptic Catholics that didn't want the laws of Yahweh. They rejected the book of Yahweh. You've got to get that in your mind. They established their own righteousness. That's shown in Genesis, and Yahweh said that they were going to take this throughout the world. This was prophesied that the Catholic Church would do what they're doing today. And don't be misled by thinking, well, I don't even see too many Catholic churches around. Surely if they're ruling the earth, we would see them all over the place. No, you can see their teachings, and that's what I think it's in the Sabbath Every Question Answered booklet, where Pastor wrote that years ago, where it actually showed that the Protestants would agree that the Sabbath was changed by the Catholic Church, but they were okay with that. They're not okay with the Pope's authority, and they don't want to go pay the Pope his tribute, but the Catholics changed. The Catholic Church and the popes and the emperors of Rome, they changed these laws, and we're just going to go with that, because everybody's doing it, like Christmas and Easter and Halloween and all these other pagan days. We're just going to go with that. So you can see how strong it is. I mean, look in society today, where you see from maybe when you were real young, how you can see how certain things have increased in like immorality or God worship, outright God worship, like the pagan days. And then look and see how quickly, through force, the Catholic Church is able to influence the minds to do certain things. So just think about it. Pastor talked about this before. Even without the nuclear bombs, without the nuclear wars coming, which they are coming, but for some people that are convinced that there's no nuclear war ever going to come, okay, let's go with that. How far along is it going to be before, things like homosexuality, abortions, living off of a bottle of pills is just going to be the norm, like Christmas, Easter, and Halloween and birthdays are today for most people who live in society today? How long will it be? I don't think it'd be very long, because look at how far we've seen morality take a nosedive just since television was invented in 1934. Okay, and really didn't become popular, and everyone didn't have it in their homes until the late 80s and early 90s, and now everyone is pretty much, able to be taught this wickedness. But remember, Yahweh allowed this, okay? He gave this to Yada, okay, the tribe of Yada, to actually have this scepter of rulership, to be able to actually go Satan's way, to show what rebellion against Yahweh's laws and disobedience brings. Okay, and pride and arrogance, because we see that amongst the religions today, the pride and the arrogance, when they reject the scriptures, but yet they always have something to complain about. You always see complaints, but they reject the scriptures. The answers are there. It's like, oh, that was done away with, but these people are really evil. It's funny how you can find different people that have different forms of evil. It depends what school of evil you went to, of what is evil or not evil, But that's shown in Genesis. Remember Genesis chapter 49, where this was actually laid out, what would take place in these last days. And Yahweh said they were going to take this throughout the world. What were they going to take? They were going to take this Coptic religion, this other way to salvation, you know? Jesus, Mary, and whatever else they need to save them, all their many, many dead saints that they worship. If they just believe the Scriptures, Yahweh said they were going to put this rebellion throughout the world. That is shown in Genesis chapter 49 in the last days. So when you see this, and then you see that, so when you see that, and then you see this right here, you know that Daniel is speaking of the same time period that Genesis 49 was speaking of. Okay? And Genesis 49 showed what would befall in the last days. It showed here how the 12 tribes of Israel were Christians who rejected Yahweh's laws. They rejected Yahweh's teaching, and they taught their own way of religion. And that's what we've seen has taken over the face of the earth today. Now we're going to go over here to verse 22. In verse 22 on page 70, Pastor reads Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1, where it says, "And there came one of the 7 Malachim. These are the messengers of Yahweh. These are the messengers of Yahweh, who he shows in the 7-lamp lampstand that is shown throughout the Holy Scriptures." Anytime you see this lampstand, it represents Yahweh's works that he has prophesied. And Moshe said he will have no others. Remember, he will have no other works except these that are prophesied. You know, and Yahweh is just not, he's not just lacking in talent and ability to create an 8th lamp lampstand. You know, we see the Jews did that. It's not a whole lot, right? To mold out an 8th lamp lampstand. No, Yahweh made the 7th lamp lampstand because he's only going to have 7 works. That's it. 7 works, and it's going to be done. It's going to be it. It's going to be an end to this Christian Coptic religion. And so we see here, remember in Moshe chapter 3, where Yahweh shows he'll have no other works than those he prophesied of, and we see represented on the 7-lamp lampstand. In closing here, we're going to go over here to verse 35 on page 71, where you realize what you have to do to obtain salvation. Yeshua said, remember he talked about not being worried about our daily concerns. We're always going to have daily concerns, and if you run out of some, go ask somebody. I'm sure they have some you can borrow. Daily concerns pop up, quicker than the stickers grow up during the summertime. Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, "Seek first the kingdom of Yahweh." Not the kingdom of God's, but the kingdom of Yahweh and his righteousness. Okay, so we see we have to seek Yahweh's kingdom and his righteousness. And that's why we've been called the Yahweh's house, men. And if you feel like you've been here for a long time and you're just doing the same old things, we got to wake up. We got to wake up and stop doing the same old things and start overcoming and converting completely to righteousness. But don't allow our minds to drift off into, la-la land thinking, well, man, maybe I should have never moved here yet, Maybe I should have stayed where I was at. I had a nice job and a lot of bills, and that was pretty nice. Maybe I need to find some more bills. I need a new credit card. That's what I need. Yeah, the end's coming anyway, so I just start swiping that thing and give it some time, and hopefully that just works out for itself. Now, man, Yahweh brought us here when he brought us here, and praise Yahweh for the blessing to be able to learn and grow and to be able to refine our character together, so that we would be able to make it into his kingdom and be his righteous, holy people. We can never lose sight of that. We got to continue. Pastor puts Matthew chapter 6, verse 33 in almost every publication, but we should be reading that consistently also. And then we see here in closing on verse 45 here, on page 72, verse 45, where Pastor says, and he's talking here about how that Roe versus Wade, which that's in the news here recently, but he's talking about how they were looking for someone to use to bring forth their will, and they found someone, but either later in life the lady was totally opposed to it and tried to reverse it. That was the person that was put down as Roe. It says that was put on to bring this way forward. And this is what they do, Just think about that. Satan deceives the whole world so she can call up and bring up any person at any time to bring about her will. But this was used to get the power and make you think it's okay to kill babies. Because people used to have some common sense and they realized that you don't kill babies, Babies gestate and they grow and they're delivered and they're born, and you try to take care of them and nourish them and get them to where they can raise up their own babies. And then they say, oh no, that's not murder. That child was not alive. Pastor says, well, you stupid idiot, what made you think you had to kill it if it wasn't alive? All right? And that just shows their reasoning and their senseless minds, as the great apostle Shaul wrote in Romans chapter 1. You know, they say abortion, it's not murder because the fetus is not alive. It's a fetus. It's an unborn fetus, you know. But after 20-something weeks, you know, okay, we got to you got to go to a different state because, you know, we don't allow that over here. But if it's not murder because the fetus is not alive, the baby's not alive, then why do we got to be killing it? And that's what Pastor showed in the simplest, easiest, oaky words of showing the foolishness that we see in society today. Amen. I'm all out of time. If you all please stand. May Yahweh bless your Sabbath. May Yahweh bless you. Understand at this time I have the great opportunity to turn it over to the great Khan, Kenneth Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, men. Please be seated. We're going to go ahead and pick up there, right there where the great Kohan left off. You know, one thing that I was thinking about when he read that last verse there, and the way you know, the idiocy of the world, you know, is this thing about logic. You know, because that was brought up, you know, I think this past Sabbath, you know, about the way that the world considers making a decision. They look at logic rather than what we do or what we should be doing, and that's to apply Yahweh's laws. And in applying that law, you know, I also had that belief in the prophecy that brought that law forward. You know, the law didn't come forth all at one time in the great house of Yahweh. I know years ago, you know, there was many things, even when I first came, that had not been brought forward. And it's kind of like that scripture that Pastor covers here also, you know, here a little, there a little. You know, we're not going to learn it all at one time. And it's kind of like, I think even in the book, in this sermon here, Pastor, it said, you know, even if you read the book of Yahweh, any of the books, in one day, you know, how much of it would you actually retain? You know, your subconscious mind would retain all of it, every single word of it. But how much would we retain in being able to bring forth the decision, you know, as soon as something comes up? But in any case, the point that I wanted to make is, you know, what we have been taught here in the house of Yahweh is to apply the law to that specific circumstance. Don't use logic. You know, it's like what the great Kohan he said here, you know, in repeating Pastor's words. You know, I mean, it's totally, you know, well, they may consider it logic that it's an unborn fetus. I mean, it's a living life that is within that woman. You know, and murder is nothing but taking life away. So with that, let's go ahead and go on over to the next page. We're going to start in verse 48, down there at the bottom of the left column. Pastor is in, let's see here, verse 25. So he's still in Daniel 8. Okay, so he's in Daniel 8, verse 25, and through this policy, through this same one's policy in this time period right now, now think about that and look at the title, you know, because the title is The Gathering of Refugees for Yahweh's Service is taking place when? In this generation right now. You know, this whole sermon, if you read it, I reread it today. If you read it, it's very, very easy to understand the way Pastor explains how this is all in prophecy. Everything that has taken place throughout the world, especially in the lands where the refugees, and they're right here on our border, you know, in Mexico, you know, even those coming from Central America, you know, how this all fits in prophecy. And we're going to cover a scripture. Actually, it's on the same page where Pastor refers back to a scripture that he had noted in the beginning of this sermon that shows this. He didn't explain it in detail, but he showed it's something that we should be looking at. Okay, so going on there, Pastor says, in reading verse 25, he says, he will also cause craft, deceit, and fraud to succeed in his hand, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and by peace, or declaring peace, destroy many. Yes, it's coming. They'll destroy many, declaring peace. They'll destroy many, declaring peace, in the form of a question. There will be depopulation while he's saying he's going to bring peace. And of course, we know this is all being orchestrated out of the Catholic Church. And of course, we know that the Pope is the spokesman for the Vatican. He will also stand up against the Prince of Princes. So who is the Prince of Princes? Yeshua, exactly. Yeshua Messiah is the Prince of Princes. If you remember, let's just turn to it and read it. I don't want you to miss that. You see the Prince of Princes, and in verse 49 he says, hold your place right there in Daniel now and turn over to Revelation 17:14. Now in Revelation 17:7 you see the 7 heads, and we know that this is talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Verse 9 says, these are 7 hills on which this religion sits, this great city sits, the leader of the kings of the earth. How could you not recognize that that's the Catholic Church? I mean, come on. It's even written, as Pastor showed us, in the encyclopedias, and all of the worldly references. Okay, do you know of another religion that has a city that sits on 7 hills, and especially all named after gods, that passes laws to get rid of all forms of holiness? Come on, be honest with yourself. This is fully described. This religion is fully described to you. And we know that we have been the only, if you want to call it religion or a religious belief, that has actually come out totally against the Vatican and condemned the Vatican and exposed the sins of the Vatican. Although there may be other religions that do not agree with the teachings of the Catholic Church, they don't even really realize that they're part of it, because they're following the same thing that the Catholic Church instituted. Okay? And it doesn't matter whether it's Christianity or Muslim. Let's go ahead and drop down to verse 52. Okay, now Pastor says, let's go over to Isaiah 43. Then he says, no, we've got to go back to Daniel 12 before we go to Isaiah 43. Daniel 12:3. Now, it's really important to see what he says next. He says, remember we started in Daniel 11:44, where it says, tidings will come to this man. Okay, so where he's talking about is, if you have your book, if you'll turn back to verse 15. Okay, so turn back to verse 15. Verse 15 is on page 69. And Pastor had said there in verse 52, remember we started in Daniel 11:44, where it says, tidings will come to this man. Now this is one of the things that's going to take place. Okay, so he's trying to give us some meat to chew on, to try to look and see what's getting ready to come out, what he's getting ready to teach us. Now, if you go back to verse 15 in the beginning of the sermon there, Pastor says in Daniel 12, to understand this, you'd have to go back to Daniel 11:44. Now, he starts reading the verse here. He says, but tidings out of the east. Okay, now remember this, and remember the title of this sermon. about the refugees or the gathering of the refugees. All for the service of Yahweh's house. That's all got to be put together to get this and understand it. Now, Pastor says, I don't want to cover this part right now. It's taking place. Okay, but what he means that it's taking place, it's in this generation. It's what Yeshua and all of the prophets have prophesied of. This last generation, the last days. I don't want to cover this part right now. It's taking place with certain politicians. So we see that, and then just think about what took place in this past week where President Trump's son-in-law, I'm forgetting his first name, Jared, went to Israel and also made the pitch, to Hamas again to try to get everything going again. And he made a comment. And in that article, he made a comment that I don't know how Hamas is going to act. It's been the same old thing for the last 25 years. Okay, now think about that. Subtract 25 from 2018, and what do you get? 1993. What took place in 1993? Yes, the Oslo Accords. Always remember, they don't say nothing for nothing. Everything has meaning to it. Okay? So Pastor says it's taking place with certain politicians and the religion shown in chapter 11, and he's talking about Daniel 11 now, but I will explain this as soon as I see who fulfills this prophecy so you can understand it too. Okay, remember, that was in the second Roman month of the year 2017, a little bit over a year ago. So let's go back to verse 52. Pastor says, and again he says, now this is one of the things that's going to take place. Okay, meaning that it's taking place at a future time. Maybe even as we speak right now. Okay, verse 45, and he will plant the dwellings of his palace between the seas, the glorious holy mountain of Zion, yet he will come to his end, and none will help him. Now keep those things in mind because you're going to see them take place very shortly now. Always putting us in the know so that when things take place, we won't be held off guard. Okay, look at Daniel 12 now, and we see in verse 1, this is the great time of trouble. This is the same time that Joshua spoke about for this generation. In verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. And of course, we know this is speaking about the resurrection, and Pastor goes on to say, we've shown this resurrection also by Yeshua in this generation. In this generation, you're going to see it. It's never been promised or been foretold in prophecy for any other work. And like what the great Kahan said, there won't be a number 9, a number 8, Number 7 is it. This work, the seventh Moloch, is the last work. Praise Yahweh. Okay, so let's, we need to jump ahead a little bit. Let's go to verse 58, okay, over there on the next column. Okay, well, let's back up a little bit. Let's go to 57. Isaiah 43:28, and this is all what he's getting ready to talk about what had taken place with Hitler. We know this is all prophecy, and that was done in order to take out one spokesman, And, well, actually, it would have taken out 2 spokesmen. But keep that in mind. Okay, found on page 558, therefore I would dissolve the Levitical priesthood. He did, meaning Yahweh. He dissolved it. They no longer have it on the 7 hills of Rome. They destroyed the temple in 70 AY. They destroyed the house of Yahweh, killed who they thought were all the Sabbath keepers, and no one else would ever dare keep the Sabbath after that. Now remember what the Kohan spoke about earlier, in not, in keeping the Sabbath and turning your foot away from every other thing that we were doing in the past, on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is an educational day in the house of Yahweh. You're bringing it in right now, with the men's law class, okay? And no one else would ever dare keep the Sabbath after that. Well, surprise, surprise, Hitler had to kill 6 million. He found 6 million that they didn't want there, so he tried it again. He killed 6 million. They thought that would be the last of them. No, the list goes on. And I always remember, about one of the things that comes to my mind there when Pastor said that was about Noah. Yahweh will always allow that they be a spokesman, a one to pass the message on. Okay? There's no way that this work, the 7th work, could ever be destroyed. Okay? In verse 58, keeping all of this in mind now, this word is an ever-growing thing. This word, the great house of Yahweh, is an ever-growing thing. The laws of Yahweh and the prophecies will forever be brought forth by the house of Yahweh. Okay? Not one of these is going to fail. Turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath. He says that, in the form of a question. You may die for it, but it's eternal. What we're doing today is an eternal work that will take place forever. And it's hard to comprehend that, because we've been bred and looked at life and death, and this has been bred into our genes, trying to get it in our minds that everything is going to come to an end. Well, no, everything's not going to come to an end. The house of Yahweh will never come to an end, and this work will never come to an end. Okay? Praise Yahweh. You may die for it, but it's eternal. It means eternal life. Turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath, which is what you and I are doing here right now. We will not break the Sabbath. We will come to the house of Yahweh and be educated. And if we can't do it here, we know also that it's done, through the media sources and through the writings, through the prophetic word, through the reach out programs, through the internet, everything. There's no other work that has brought forth this message of Yahweh's soon coming kingdom to the entire earth except this 7th era, all under the great 7th Malach, the great Khan Yisrayl Hawkins. Okay, so turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath, Isaiah 58. That's the start of everlasting life. You need to underline that if you got that. I got it underlined in my book. That's the start, okay? If you turn your foot from breaking the Sabbath, that's the start of everlasting life. That's what this whole sermon is based upon, is to get us in our mind that we have to be educated in the laws and the prophecies in the house of Yahweh. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go now. Okay, let's go to verse 65. Okay, go to the next page, verse 65. Okay, and I will give to my 2 witnesses to perform their prophetic offices, and they will foretell events about the 3½ years, those cast about in darkness. And we know that this work was sent by commandment. We're going to actually cover that in Zechariah, I think, right here in the next couple of chapters, or the next couple of verses. This work was given to the 2 witnesses, which we are a part of. We are a seed of the 2 witnesses. Pastor couldn't do it all by himself. He needed some help. It's just like whenever we have duties on a Sabbath, we need help. If you don't have nothing to do, please volunteer. You know, we can use help in any part in the work of Yahweh. Okay? Okay, so continuing on in verse 66, verse 4, these are mark out as it were. And of course, that's also even in the book of Yahweh, as it were. You know, these are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lamps of the 7-lamp lampstand, ministering. Okay? Remember that word ministering, because that's exactly what Zechariah 4, 5, and 6 show they will be doing together. Ministering for the Father of the earth, both of the witnesses together. It was prophesied that there would be a time that they would minister together, they would separate, and then they would actually come back together to reestablish this and under the laws of the land, this great house. Okay, it had to be done by the 2 witnesses, remember that. And then, of course, Jacob was given to the curse. Okay, Pastor goes on to say, I will give to them to do this. One dies, but they do minister together for a certain time. It's shown they have a separation. They separate, but then they go back together when it's called to do so with the lawsuit, as the great Kohan Benjamin brought out this morning. Okay, let's go over to verse 71. Okay, now look at verse 14, and he's in Zechariah 6. Okay, no, he's in Zechariah 4, I believe. Okay, then he said, these are the 2 anointed ones who stand for the supreme ruler of the earth. They're the ones who actually stand on behalf of Yahweh, the supreme ruler of the earth. And in verse 72, underline this. It's very, very important for us to understand this. The gods don't rule the universe. Okay, the gods don't rule the universe. Who's in control? Yahweh is in complete control. They deceive the gods, speaking of the gods, they deceive and connive to get rid of man because they don't want mankind ruling over them. They know that man's going to, and they're trying right now to figure out a way to destroy heaven and earth, hoping that will stop it. Because that would be the only way to disrupt Yahweh's plan. But we know that Yahweh has given us the promise that this work will never be extinguished. Okay? Next page, for the sake of time, go to verse 82. Now, Pastor is still in Zechariah. Okay, he's still in Zechariah, verse 82. For he will branch out from his place and he will build the house of Yahweh. Now, this is speaking of Pastor. Okay, I don't know of another in all the world, another place that has legal right to the name House of Yahweh. And that's what Jacob and I fought together to establish. We are the only ones on the face of the earth who have legal right to this name, the House of Yahweh. It's given us in prophecy. Why wouldn't we fight for it? And this is an ongoing fight now, so don't think that we're exempt from this. We should always be ready to stand up and fight for the house of Yahweh. Okay? It was given to us to do this, and yes, we ministered together to do it, as was brought out as Yahweh said we would. Okay, verse 13, yes, he will build the house of Yahweh. He will bear glory and will sit and rule on his throne. He will be a priest upon his throne, and the council of peace will be between them both, him, Pastor, and Yeshua, the son of Yahweh. Okay, go down to verse 85. Yahweh's house is taking a message sent by commandment, and we know that. Well, let's go ahead and read Dan Zechariah 5. Just go up a little bit in that previous verse. Then the Malach, the messenger who was speaking with me, came forward and said to me, lift up your eyes now and see and understand. I'm telling you now, look at this. This is the Malach. The Malach is Pastor. Okay, read it and understand it. He's telling us, look at this, Read it and understand what I'm saying here. That which is sent by commandment. Understand this is sent by commandment. Yahweh's house is taking a message sent by commandment. You know, it is the only work on the face of the earth that has this authority. Boy, for time, we're really going to have to move here a little bit. Let's go over to verse 91. Okay, verse 91. Now, Pastor is in, that's what it says in Revelation 17. Okay, well, verse 91, it says, verse 4, but with righteousness, that's Yahweh's laws. Remember 1 John or 1 Yochanan 3, righteousness is practicing the laws of Yahweh. With righteousness will he judge the poor. Judge the poor. Remember that. Okay, did you get that? Yes, we invite the poor. And remember, if you hadn't read the next the next sermon, which was the next week, all of this was before Passover of that year, where Pastor actually talks about the fact that there would be meals, there would be free meals at the feast. Okay? Yes, we invite the poor and reprove with equity for meek, humble of the earth. He will smite the earth with the rod of his mouth. Okay, that is the sinful earth. With the rod of his mouth and with the breath of his lips will he slay the wicked. Now, what Pastor's doing here now, he's bringing this whole sermon, into this culmination at the end. These last couple of verses, are really important here. Okay, in verse 5, righteousness will be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Now, Yahshua started his work in 1 to 3 AY. He turning over to Hebrews 1. There are some discrepancies about when he was born, but he started it within 1 to 3 years after the AY, which means after Yahshua, identification. He became the high priest over the house of Yahweh. You see that in Hebrews 1:13, 10:21, 10:16. Now keep in mind everything that Pastor has covered about the prophecies, about the refugees, and of course about the fact that the branch and Yahshua working together. Okay? And Yahshua said about our time in Matthew 16:18 that he will establish his house. I will build my house, he said. Yahshua is a high priest. As Yahweh showed in Zechariah 6, Yahshua is the high priest. I got up to this point, and if you remember it, then this next sermon is really going to be exciting to you, really exciting to you. So everybody remember to follow along next week. Everything for this sermon goes right into the next sermon. Okay? Let's see here. Okay, drop down to 95. They're getting prepped right now for that time period. So who is he talking about? The refugees. They're getting prepped right now for that time period. Okay, I said prep. That's occurring each week. We see the sermons are going to the world, all the world. We're getting feedback from them. So we know that they are getting them. They are converting. They are repenting and converting. Right now, as they hear my voice, they know that we are the house of Yahweh. They know that I am Yahweh's last days witness. They know that this house of Yahweh is carrying forth this work to all the world right now according to the prophecies. There's no doubt if you know the scriptures. If you know the scriptures, there can't be a doubt that this is Yahweh's work that he's prophesied would be going forward at this time. Okay, and in verse 96, because remember this next sermon is speaking about the refugees and some of the work of the refugees. Okay, the people are getting ready to be brought here. We're getting them ready to come to the house. Once they get here, they will know. They're studying hard right now. They're getting literature. They're getting it online. They're going onto the computers, into the Yisrayl Hawkins Says program, and they're reading as much as they can, as fast as they can. They are learning in many of these places where they're reading they're also sharing it with others. And this is a big plus. Remember the work of Noah. Okay? They take this literature and they take the computers and they're actually showing it to others and letting them listen to it. So there's hope being built among the people where there was no hope. And when the time is just right, in this last generation, right? In this last generation, and when the time is just right, those people will be here on the land that belongs to the house of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh.